This is the second part of the presentation which outlines how the Stroke Rehab App will support the community care stage of the stroke recovery journey. The next group of data object classes represent personal information about people involved in various stroke recovery journeys. Firstly, we have data objects that represent what is known about people and families. Obviously, the fundamental social unit is the family, whether it be a nuclear or extended family. A person may be a member of more than one extended family, including the families of his or her parents, their own families, and the families of their children and siblings. A person may play different roles in different families. For example, a man may play the role of father in his own family, the role of son in his parents' family, and maybe the role of grandson in the family of his grandparents. This structure even allows a person to play the role of friend or neighbour in a family with which they have no genetic relationship. Thus, it permits the construction of a comprehensive picture of the family and social environment in which a stroke survivor may live. These facts are represented by family member data objects, where a person may play a role in many families, and a family may have roles played by many persons. Secondly, we have data objects that represent what is known about where people and families live, where it is recognised that members of a family may reside in more than one residence, and each resident must be located on a particular block. These facts are represented by family residence data objects. These represent the fact that a family member may reside at many blocks, and a block may be the residence of many family members. Now, we can easily use the geographic information we talked about earlier, along with the family residence data, to determine which locality, which municipality, which state, and which country a person lives in. These data objects can be stored in the central database and distributed to various stakeholder databases as required. For example, it may be distributed to databases used by a survivor's therapists, or to a database used by a stroke liaison officer. The next group of data object classes represent information about stroke as a particular case of a chronic disorder. So we have things called chronic disorder objects. Now, stroke is a chronic disorder that affects roughly 35,000 Australians each year, along with the hundreds of thousands of stroke survivors and carers who have suffered strokes in previous years. Recovery from any chronic disorder, and particularly stroke, is a long journey which continues long after the stroke survivor leaves the hospital system. To reflect this long recovery journey, it is helpful to talk about stages in the recovery journey. These stages are represented by recovery stage data objects, where the recovery journey from any chronic disorder is seen as having many recovery stages. Now, recovery from stroke is a journey with 3 distinct recovery stages, namely an acute care stage, a subacute care stage, and a community care stage. And the Stroke Recovery App is primarily interested in the community stage of the stroke recovery journey. We also need to recognise the existence of service data objects and service hierarchy data objects. Now, progress through any recovery stage can involve getting access to many services, defined as including goods, services and programs that are offered across many medical disciplines, many community service sectors, and with many possible not-for-profit and for-profit providers. These services can be seen as being arranged in the form of a service hierarchy, with therapy services being divided up into, say, physiotherapy services, OT services, speech therapy services, and psychological services. And of course, each of these services can be subdivided into more specialised services if necessary. Now we can see how the chronic disorder information can be used to define a generic stroke recovery journey and the types of services that may be associated with each recovery stage. The data objects that represent this information can be stored in the central database and distributed to various stakeholder databases as required. For example, it may be distributed to databases used by a survivor's therapist, or to the databases used by stroke liaison officers. The last group of data object classes represent information about what services are available, where they are available, and who has used those services. Firstly, we have service availability data objects, which represent information about providers of various services by indicating which offices of which organisations are offering which services. This effectively becomes a directory of stroke services covering the whole of the stroke recovery journey. And because of the link between office and locality objects we described earlier, we can now clearly see which services are available in which municipalities and which municipalities have service deficiencies. This is crucial information for the planning of community-based stroke care services, particularly in regional and rural communities. The service availability objects will be created and maintained over the internet by service providers themselves, maybe even for a small annual fee, and will allow the publishing of hard copy, electronic and web-based stroke service directories for each municipality throughout Australia. Such directories will be an invaluable tool for stroke survivors and for stroke liaison officers. And we also have service usage data objects, which could be created whenever a service was provided to a stroke survivor or carer, and could be used to inform community healthcare planners about things like who has provided community-based stroke rehab services, who has used community-based stroke rehab services, and how far stroke survivors had to travel to access stroke rehab services. These service usage objects could eventually be matched up with stroke event disability objects to answer questions like, what is the effectiveness of services offered by service providers in particular municipalities in terms of recovery from disabilities? What policies are needed to plug service provision deficiencies in particular municipalities? And what training or recruitment programs are needed to improve the quality of service provision in particular municipalities? We can summarise this presentation by pointing out that the central database that supports the Stroke Rehab App can be used to store and distribute geographic information which can be obtained from various government websites, organisational information which can be obtained directly from organisations who wish to participate in the stroke recovery industry by identifying what products or services they provide in which communities. Personal information which identify the individual people, families, family roles and family residences of people of interest. Chronic disorder information which can be used to define a generic stroke recovery journey and the services that are associated with each stage of that recovery journey. Service availability information which identify what services are offered by which officers of which service providers in which localities. Service delivery information about which services have been used by stroke survivors living in particular locations throughout Australia. This means that the central database that supports the Stroke Rehab App can be used to generate comprehensive stroke service directories for each municipality throughout Australia in either a hard copy form, as PDF files, as services websites, or as inbuilt location-specific directories in the Stroke Rehab App. These directories will be an invaluable source of information for both stroke survivors and stroke liaison officers.